Okay, so the topic I wanted to talk about a little bit today, and thank you for letting me talk about my topic. I'm really eager to kind of get this out.
Good.
So
Excellent.
I really appreciate that. Is dealing with power, and I wanted to kind of preface what I'm about to say, because you can take this a whole lot of directions. Why is this guy ever interested in power in the first place? So let me just say, when I was 4 years old, an experience I had was I went into a surgery, kind of tricked. I felt like I was tricked by the nurses in order to get me to go to sleep, to subdue myself to this medication, which, put me under. And then I woke up in a surgery, and I looked down, I saw the doctor working on me and surrounded by nurses and things like this. And I didn't really have a great understanding of what was going on. I was only 4 years old. As far as I knew, they could be trying to kill me. Mm-hmm. Right. So I started kicking, and what's interesting is I still remember to this day.
Yeah.
It's imprinted in my mind, a vivid picture of me kicking the doctor with my left foot, one of the nurses grabbing my left hand, and there was some sort of device for them to hold it down like a leather strap. Mm-hmm. Left hand first, right hand, left leg, right leg. And as they were tying my right leg down, they gasped me out into unconsciousness. So you can imagine, as a kid, right, you can feel this power differential.
Yes.
And it's something that's kind of seared into your mind. And so you go through the world with this lens, and you look at the world from this aspect of power. And so I would suggest that, maybe that's not a bad lens. Maybe there's something that we can learn from that. And what does history have to tell us about this? Mm-hmm. Now, one of my interests, and this is what I really want to go on this before I switch it over to anything you want to say about it. But my concern with power is how to avoid things like a Hitler or a Stalin, or just learning more about it. It's not Tom is a megalomaniac, right, type of thing. But my argument is that everyone should have an interest in power, if not because of these things I've already said, but the Constitution, it constantly talks about power. And I guess my question is, well, what is their deal? Why the founding fathers of this country in the Constitution enshrine so much about power? What is their deal with it? And so your thoughts on power, is it interesting to you? Do you have thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on with that definition and understanding. And great example. When you're a child, I remember when I was much less significant, I go to the doctor and they would use that tongue suppressor and to say ah, and they put that in your mouth. Well, I got a very high gag factor. I dreaded that more than anything. But I had no choice. I remember when I actually was bigger than the doctor physically. And I remember the day they said, say on, he had that stick, and I looked at him and I said, no.
I don't think so.
Yeah, we're not doing that. Power.
Yeah.
I had the power to tell him no, but up until that point, I never realized it, and I never took advantage of it. So power, it's interesting. When people use the word power, they talk about it in the sense of domination, usually. Right. And it's not really just domination. It's that we all have, everybody's heard of Tony Robbins, and he's called, what's it, power, unlimited power that you have. And his perspective take on that is it's in there, and you have more ability to do things than you realize that you have, and you can extend that power out. But I think they say power corrupts, and I think in a way there's a lot of examples of that. Even if you see our government today, they get caught up in a activity, and it becomes its own reality. And I use the term, their feet come off the ground. And I think that when people have a certain amount of power, when they first got that power, that said power, they have a perspective and they do things a certain way. Well, once that becomes automatic, then they might move into the next layer and the next layer. I wonder if Hitler in the beginning when he was trying to create the superior race, actually had the concept or the agenda to conquer the world? Or was that something that he kind of grew into? It's like, well, man, I've made this far. Why stop now?
Yeah, I mean, you made so many good points. We could talk forever on some of those things. I do want to hit two things that you said at least. One, yeah, so you pointed out Lord Acton when he said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that was one blurb from a larger piece, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And you said about Hitler. So there were two views. I've studied a lot of history in England, and where there was a lot of discussion and writing about power and things like that. So there were two major views about power. One is, power corrupts absolutely. And then the other view was that power doesn't necessarily change your character, but power reveals the character you currently have.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so there were two views on it. My particular view is both can be true, not within the same person, but you have some people who might have an ego, let's say, and they already would be abusive of power as soon as they got it. But then it's also true, I believe it's absolutely true, that if the more power you have, the more likely you are to abuse it. So depending on where you start, and maybe this is going to get off on a bit of a tangent, but I am a Lord of the Rings fan.
Yes.
So you might have seen some of my things down here.
Yes.
So the Ring of Power, and in his book and his work, which has become famous now, and there's movies on it and all of this. There's a character which is a hobbit, which is more resistant to, I guess, the temptation of power. And so that's why it is that a hobbit carries it rather than a human being or an elf or dwarf or any of these other characters in his fictional work. But his fictional work has a great basis in fact and truth in real life when he's discussing power and the Ring of Power and the effects of power and all of this stuff. In fact, the whole idea of the Ring of Power is it's called the Ring of Ganges, and it goes back to the Greeks. It was this idea that if you had a ring of power which made you invisible, what would you do with it? And so there was this discussion about how people would use it, and some people would use it to do evil, and then how good is power if it, I don't want to use the word cause, but if it influences you to do things that you would not otherwise do if you couldn't.
That's a great perspective on it. Not otherwise do. So it changes you.
It can.
Well, I guess it not necessarily, it can. Yeah, you're right, it can. Not necessarily will, but it opens up doors of opportunity that you didn't have normally. Now that you have the power, you can do that. And that's where you need, that's where integrity comes into play. Without integrity and foundational beliefs and principles, where do you stop? Yeah. Just whatever satisfies you, I guess. What do you feel?
So, I mean, the founders, and we can get in more depth in this, but the founders had this idea, right, which they acquired through history, that you need to limit. You need to check and balance powers, and you need to limit it in some capacity, because it's kind of like, what's the thing that Ronald Reagan used to say, but it was actually a Russian saying, which he used because he knew that they would understand it. Trust but verify, right? So you don't want to, you hope that you can trust in whoever you put in power, but you want to limit that power so they don't have the ability to do some of the things. Real quick, let me go back, if I can, to Lord Acton, because I wanted to make sure I hit on that point real quick. Is Lord Acton, when he was writing that, I read what he wrote, and it was all in the context of history. What he was saying is that we have, basically, I'm kind of paraphrasing this, we as historians have perverted history. And this is the way that we've perverted history. Because when we write about kings and powerful people, particularly he was referring to kings and popes, he specifically mentions in his writing, we often will talk favorably about them here and now, and maybe skip saying some of the bad things about them, right? Because we value our lives back then, and we value our careers and all the things that they had. But he said we have a duty to history when we write history, instead of his experience of what was going on with people writing history, is that people were writing history in such a way that it looked favorably upon kings and popes when it should not have. They weren't recording it factually.
Boy, you've opened up a whole can of worms there.
But yeah, we still have that problem today, do we not? And we will definitely come back to that issue. So I promise you, there'll be a whole. And if you want to get into that right now, feel free.
Go ahead.
But that was the context in which he was writing. He's saying these people, the popes back in that day, the pope and the kings have so much power. But he said he was basically making an ethical argument that despite this power that they have, and pointing out this pattern that he had noticed, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was basically, that whole thing came from his argument that we do not need to allow this. We need to record history in such a way that this type of thing can be avoided, and we have a duty to history. So even if we kind of make it look like right now that everything's fine and don't record all the negatives and things like that, history should record the reality.
What time frame was he around?
I would have to look that.
Just roughly century.
I'm thinking 14, 15.
Back in that day. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is he got that concept. He proposes a concept that we have a responsibility as a people to accurately record history so it will offer value for the future. I just find that interesting that it's not like, tell me what you think. It's not just necessarily your perspective or your views on a topic or a happening, more so that it is, you've got to paint a picture of the reality. And that's going to be another great episode for us, because that's where I wanted to go is, if you have an accident and you have 10 witnesses, you will not get 2 of the same story. They'll always have different flares to it, and every one of them in their mind is telling the absolute truth. And because we filter things in our mind, so, even though that's really what should happen, I don't know if we have the ability to, how do you balance that? How do you, and that's definitely one, that'll be a question for another day. But in any event, it's a great topic, the concept of power, and it's given me a deeper understanding, with power, because it's not just having power over someone.
So, real quick, I think we have said enough to put our first podcast together, but don't leave. I want to record the second part. I basically said I had something to say, and I haven't said it yet.
Well, let it rip, man.
So I just want to take a quick break here, and we'll get right back to it. If you want to get a cup of coffee, more water, or whatever, and we'll continue the conversation. How does that sound?
Sounds great.